distracting by my phone.
Exactly. Don't get a phone call right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The exact time. My mother.
For that reason.
Telling you to straighten yourself. Sit up.
Okay, good morning all, and you're very welcome to this research report launch. Thanks to the necessarily small number of people that are joining us in person, and thanks as well to those of you who are joining us on the Facebook live stream. The programme for this morning is that the report will be launched by Ethel Buckley, Deputy General Secretary of SIPTU, and we're really grateful to Ethel for taking the time to be with us here this morning, and to SIPTU for supporting this work. After Ethel has made her introductory remarks, myself and David Doyle, two of the co-authors of the report, will briefly set out some of the findings and recommendations. Micahel O'Brien, who is the Fisheries Campaign Lead for the International Transport Workers Federation, he'll then respond to the report and speak about some of the new initiatives that the ITF is embarking on in this area. Okay, so I'll hand over to Ethel.
Thanks very much, Clíodhna. And so good morning, everyone, to everyone who's here and everyone who's joining us on the Facebook page in Ireland, but also especially to some comradely greetings to other trade unionists around the world who are watching, other affiliates of the International Transport Federation. Hello also to you from Dublin. So I would just like to start by thanking Dr. Clíodhna Murphy and Dr. David Doyle and their PhD candidate, Stephanie Thompson, all of whom are from the Department of Law in Maynooth, as you know, and Micahel O'Brien, the ITF International Transport Federation Fisheries Campaign Lead, for the invitation to launch this important research. And this research, which we will launch this morning, will contribute much to deepening our understanding of the experiences of migrant fishers in the Irish fishing fleet. And the research report, as you have heard, as you will hear, was conducted by the law academics in Maynooth and funded by the ITF. And it builds on research which was published by the Migrant Rights Centre of Ireland a number of years ago. And indeed, I suppose the organising and campaigning experience of Michael's predecessor, Ken Fleming, who did sterling campaigning and inspection work in the Irish fishing industry and indeed the international fishing industry over a number of years. So I just wanted to say something about the research methodology, if I can. So recently my own union launched a new piece of research, Low Pay Republic. And we held a seminar and a webinar on the Low Pay Republic research in conjunction with two other academics from Maynooth, from the Sociology Department in Maynooth, Professor Mary Murphy and Professor Sean O'Rinn. And at that seminar, I made some remarks which I want to reiterate this morning, and they go to the importance of academics in Irish universities doing research which is applied, research which is relevant, and research that really helps us as organisers and campaigners in the trade union movement to highlight and to draw shine a spotlight on the level of worker exploitation in the labour market in Ireland. And I think I think that the researchers and the academics who undertake this applied research should be commended for doing that. I'm a big believer in it. I have been for a very long time. I really believe in the value of qualitative research. I know that quantitative researchers often look down their nose at qualitative researchers, but it's really only in qualitative discussions, conversations, interviews with workers that we get to understand their real lived experience, the reality, in fact, of workplaces, the reality of work practices, and that we get under the bonnet of what's really going on in the Irish labour market. That's not to say that quantitative research isn't important. Of course it is. Official data, statistics, but the official data will only tell you so much. So I really commend researchers who undertake this style of research. It's really important to us. And it's also really important that it is conducted in the academy or conducted in universities, because it adds a legitimacy to the actual findings. Dare I say that the level of media interest in this research possibly would not be what we've seen over the last few days, which has been so commendable and so excellent. And here today as well, we're joined by so many people from the media. Dare I say that if trade unions themselves or just the ITF had conducted the research, that the level of interest mightn't be the same as when the academy adds its voice. So I think that is very important. But I suppose the sad reality of any research on migrant workers in Ireland is that to come to the Irish labour market for many migrants in the meat industry, in agriculture, in food processing, in food production, in private transport, in haulage, in the care sector, in nursing homes, in cleaning, in securing, in catering. I could go on and on. The experience of migrant workers who come to our labour market and work in those industries is not a positive one. It is not something that Irish authorities should be proud of, because actually most research conducted on the experience of migrant workers in Ireland does show a level of low pay and exploitation which is completely unacceptable. And it varies and it differs in various industries, but one thing that we absolutely know, all of us, trade unionists, politicians, policymakers, government departments, inspectors, is that the condition that is most likely to lead to exploitation is when a worker is tethered to an employer through their immigration status. In other words, when the immigration permit is linked to a specific employer. This is an absolute recipe for exploitation and fear and underpayment in the Irish labour market and in other labour markets. I'm not saying anything here today that we don't all know. But one of the main problems in the fishing industry is that workers remain tethered to specific employers. And that causes a dynamic between workers and their employers, which can lead to gross exploitation, because people are so fearful, fishers are so fearful that their immigration status won't be renewed, or that their contract won't be renewed, or that their actual physical health and safety can be put in hazard and in danger through that unfair and exploitative relationship. In fact, if there's one thing I would want to say on behalf of SIPTU today, it is that we need to break that tether between fishers and specific employers. So there are very unique patterns of exploitation in the fishing industry, and it's important that we recognise these and that we name them and that we understand them. And in order to do that, the researchers conducted 24 semi-structured interviews with non-EEA migrant fishers, and they will go through the results of those interviews. But I think it is important to say, and something that you may not expect, is that the majority of the people interviewed have actually lived and worked in Ireland for a long time. These are not recent arrivals to our labour market. In fact, many have been here for 10 years or more, and the overwhelming majority of those interviewed have been here since the Atypical Working Scheme was adopted. And that's very valuable because we have the benefit of their long service in the industry, but we also have the benefit of them experiencing the industry before the Atypical Working Scheme and since. And unfortunately, though of no surprise to people that know this industry, the situation has not improved since the AWS. In fact, some of the research shows that it's actually gotten worse. And that is something that is a really important takeaway from the research. So look, I want to commend the ITF for financing the research, for funding the research, and for conducting the research in this way. Because what it has done is it has lifted the inevitable barrier of language. that is there for us. It has lifted the inevitable barrier of access. How do we access these workers who spend most of their time on boats, moving in the sea? How do we access these workers who are so fearful and so exploited? So it is very important to hear their actual voice. Just wanted to say that the fishing industry in particular is notoriously difficult for trade unions to organise. This is the case all over the world. This is not just the case on the island of Ireland or in our Irish seas. And for that reason, the role that the International Transport Federation plays is really important and significant. Because I think what the ITF understands is that no one union in one island or in one country can change the conditions in the globalised fishing industry. So unions have to work together in a globalised industry, and that is what the ITF facilitates and does. But the other thing that is so critical about the ITF work, and I believe that Micahel O'Brien is actually going to undertake some of this work in the coming weeks, and maybe he'll have an opportunity to talk to us about it, but is that the ITF has the opportunity to speak to workers in the donor country, in the country that they're leaving from before they leave. So in the case of Ireland, although the nationalities change over the years, currently the most important countries for us are the Philippines, Egypt and Ghana, I would imagine. And the ITF uniquely, because it's an international federation, has the opportunity to speak to the unions in those countries and to actually advise the workers before they leave that although they may think and although it may be represented to them by certain elements of the Irish fishing industry that they are coming to decent jobs, that actually when they get here that will not be the case. So SIPTU is affiliated to the ITF, as are some other Irish unions and unions who are based in Ireland. And what I want to do in conclusion is to pledge publicly, as I have done in meetings with Micahel, SIPTU support for the research findings and for the ITF demands. And specifically, SIPTU, or I on behalf of SIPTU, commit to working with the ITF on the following demands, and that is that undocumented fishers should have access to the regularisation scheme, which is promised in the programme for government, which we've been waiting for some time now. And SIPTU is a member of, early member, an absolute champion of the Justice for Undocumented Workers campaign, coordinated by the Migrant Rights Centre of Ireland. We also want any legal barriers, and we have the exact people here, the lawyers, to tell us what the legal barriers are in the Irish legislation which prevents undocumented fishers, but indeed undocumented workers in other industries, from accessing their employment rights at third parties. We would also support the ITF's demand that fishers be facilitated in varying their stamp status from stamp 1 to stamp 4 permission, and that be expedited given the prevailing circumstances in the industry in Ireland. There are other things that I could say about the AWS, about the need to change the contract to actually reflect what happens in the industry, and about crewing levels, but we might get into that in the discussion. So finally, this research that we're launching here today should act now as a call to arms for all of us here, for trade unionists, for academics, for the politicians who are watching across the road, for the journalists who are watching and who are here, for lawyers, for NGOs, for policymakers, for inspectors, campaigners, to all come together and to collaborate to bring about the changes that are necessary to eliminate exploitation and forced labour in the Irish fishing industry. So it just remains for me now to congratulate the researchers, to commend the research and to formally declare it launched.
Thank you very much, Ethel. I think that was really excellent in terms of understanding the broad context for the report and really setting it in its broader context of the treatment of migrant workers generally. So thank you very much for that. So just to let you know that the report is available on both the Maynooth University Department of Law website and also on the ITF website. We'll circulate it as well after this, after today. So what I'm just going to do now is myself and David between us are going to briefly outline the main findings of the research and the key recommendations. and that's before we hand over to Michael to respond to the report from the perspective of the ITF. This research project, as you now know, was funded by the ITF, but it was conducted at Maynooth University Department of Law by myself and David. We're both associate professors in Maynooth University Department of Law, and Stephanie Thompson, who's a PhD candidate and a John and Pat Hume scholar in the university. The aim of this study was to investigate the experiences of migrant fishers from outside the EU in the Irish fishing fleet. And as Ethel mentioned, to do this, we conducted and analysed in-depth interviews with 24 migrant fishers. And we focused in particular on working conditions, immigration issues, and experiences of enforcement. Ethel's already mentioned this, but I just wanted to highlight again in relation to the interviewees. The interviewees were all highly skilled fishers, many of whom had been fishing for their whole lives. Collectively, they had over 200 years of fishing experience between them. And as you mentioned also, many of the participants had lived and worked in Ireland for a long time. In over half the cases, it was for over 10 years. So our main aim with this report was to convey the perspective of those who are affected by these issues. And our priority has been to accurately and authentically represent the participant voice. And we hope that our report does that. So thank you to the participants for their rich insight and the information that they provided. And we hope that we've done it justice in this report. So that's just by way of introduction. So as I said, that was the overview of the project. Okay, so it's looking at current experiences of people currently working within the Irish fishing fleet. I think it's important, just for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, to provide some context for the research. So we know that in Ireland there has been a lot of attention on these issues since 2015, when the Guardian newspaper reported on exploitation of migrant workers within the Irish fishing industry. And these reports resulted in the formation of a government task force and the adoption of an atypical working scheme for non-EEA crew in the fishing fleet. And the aim of this scheme was to regularise and formalise the workers' immigration and employment status. And the scheme was one of a series of regulatory and policy efforts to address this issue. And these are discussed in detail in the report. However, despite these undoubtedly important efforts, since 2016, a range of international, regional and domestic human rights bodies have raised concerns about the operation of the scheme and the adequacy of safeguards against trafficking and exploitation. There were further reforms adopted in 2019 to address some of these issues. But this is really the background, and against this background, our aim was to assess the current picture in the industry. So I think I'm going to now hand over to David, who's going to speak a little bit about the methodology of the report and some of the findings. So sorry, David, I don't know if you can...
That's perfect.
Is that okay?
Clíodhna, thank you very much. So as Clíodhna pointed out, our analysis draws on semi-structured interviews conducted with 24 male migrant workers in the Irish fishing fleet. And these workers, unlike other migrant workers who tend to be concentrated in low pay, low skilled and often undervalued jobs, were highly skilled and experienced in the fishing sector. And as Clíodhna has pointed out also, that most of these participants had over 5 years experience in the fishing sector, and collectively these workers had over 200 years of experience in the fishing sector, both in Ireland and beyond. So the research was conducted during the ongoing COVID-19 global pandemic, and regrettably the unprecedented public health crisis made the physical interviewing of all of these workers a practical impossibility. Now the interviewees were recruited by an ITF staff member, yours truly Michael, and the duration of the interviews ranged from 34 minutes to 76 minutes. So the majority of these interviews were conducted remotely by telephone, and a small number were conducted in person at the offices of the ITF and at Maynooth University in compliance with public health regulations and advice. So from our perspective, the vulnerability of the interviewees was a primary concern. and the interviews were conducted in line with international best practice and as sensitively as possible. So the majority of these interviewees had limited knowledge of English, which was not their first language. So accordingly, the services of professional interpreters who had existing working relationships with the university and who adhered to a defined code of ethics were utilised in the majorities of these interviews. Ethical approval was also granted by Maynooth University Ethics Committee. So the international literature reveals that fishing is an industry that relies on irregular migrant workers to fill its hazardous low-paying jobs, and the range of experiences reported by these fishers range from some were quite happy with their work situation, but most of the experiences range from underpayment of wages, non-payment of compensation, irregular and excessive working hours, and at the upper end of the scale, withheld payment, control via threats of deportation or dismissal, severe harassment on the basis of race or religion, and summary dismissal. So there is a lucrative multi-million illegal fishing industry worldwide where the exploitation of workers is absolutely rife. And regrettably, it appears that the Irish fishing industry is not impervious to this trend. So the abuse of migrant fishermen in Ireland, as Clíodhna pointed out, has been well documented in recent years, and the experiences reported by the workers here for this study reinforced the previous findings of the Guardian investigation in 2015 and the Migrant Rights Centre study with respect to excessive working hours, insufficient rest periods, and payment well below the minimum wage. So one interviewee noted, for example, we would work 48 hours, and in these 48 hours, we would only get around 5 hours sleep, while another pointed out that the working day varied, some days 15 hours, some days 20. Now, some form of coercion, or more commonly deception, is likely to be present when severe forms of labour exploitation exist. And many of the workers in this study found the conditions different, as Ethel pointed out, to what they had anticipated or had been promised. So one fisher stated that he thought he was going to be working reasonable hours, for instance, but on arrival in Ireland, he found that he had to work long hours, maybe all day and all night, and not much income. And this particular participant had a substantial experience in the fishing industry. So these recollections mirror the experiences of fishermen in other jurisdictions where workers are also subjected to long hours, frequently without adequate rest periods for 7 days a week. So even among those who were on the Irish fishing fleet prior to the introduction of the atypical scheme in 2016, there were conflicting views on whether working conditions had improved in the intervening period. One interviewee, for instance, stated that non-EU workers, their situation had improved, while another, on the other hand, had stated that after the scheme, things went from bad to worse. So another one here, just to give you another example here from the qualitative research, one other fisher stated that I was getting well paid before the work permit, but after the work permit, everything changed. While another person stated that this system is not for the people, just for the owners only. For owners, it's good for them, it's not good for us. Another commonly reported problem by the migrant fishermen in this study related to payment. And in 2016, the Low Pay Commission reported that there's some evidence to suggest that illegal payment of sub-minimum wages occurs in Ireland, and that migrant workers are particularly susceptible to this, and this was borne out by the interviewees in this study. So some workers here receive substantially less remuneration than they were initially promised by the employer or legally entitled to under minimum wage legislation. And just to take another example here from the qualitative material, one fisher noted that sometimes, for example, he tells you he's going to give me €1,000 and at the end then he just gives me 200. So this is a particularly concerning practice, given that wages have been recognised as playing an important role in preventing workers' vulnerability in exploitation, as well as deepening and accelerating it. Moreover, and more worryingly, some of the boat owners exerted substantial control over workers through threats to their economic livelihood, and this served to discipline workers not to challenge seriously exploitative labour relations. And the overt nature of such threats was reflected in the comments of one interviewee. He said, like always, they're threatening me about if you don't work, I'll cancel your permit. And a similar practice was highlighted by another fisher who said, because I am threatened, I cannot work, my permit will get cancelled. The level of control was also captured by another fisherman who pointed out that if you have a contract, you feel like that you're their slave, and that migrant fishermen don't want our employers to be controlled by the employer. So all these fishermen, akin to workers in other jurisdictions and in other sectors, fear losing the job in which they're exploited. In addition to economic threats and miserable conditions, many of these participants were also subject to racial and verbal abuse on fishing vessels. Now, the connection between exploitation and racism is complex, but certain boat owners and captains were reported to be very racist. One interviewee revealed that the head of the ship was very racist. He wouldn't let us pray or fast or anything like that, and this was always causing problems. Usually, as everybody knows, an employee's religious observances are usually none of an employer's concerns, but this participant stated that the particular captain does not allow halal food on board of the ship. However, it appears that this type of racist abuse was not the preserve of the boat owners or the captains. One worker, for instance, noted that there was also racism from members of the crew, and that this tended to be aimed at specific nationalities. Of course, it's not uncommon that coming from a particular nationality or a particular ethnic background can constitute grounds for discriminatory behaviour or discrimination, but the experiences of the Migrant Rights Centre study in 2012 were found, and I suppose it was confirmed by this study, that migrant workers in Ireland often suffer severe racial discrimination and harassment. So on that point there, I'll hand you back to Clíodhna to talk about the inspections and complaints.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Two final areas in which we made findings in this report were around immigration issues and inspection and pursuing complaints. And you'll see already from this slide that these issues very much overlap with the working conditions issues that David has already outlined. And really, in summary, the interviews do suggest that the operation of the Atypical Working Scheme permission, under which the worker is contracted to an individual employer, and the necessity to renew this permission each year, this creates a power imbalance between the employer and the employee, and can be used by some employers as a mean to threaten and exploit workers. And numerous quotes included in the report illustrate this, and we could have included many more from the transcripts of the interviews. So, for example, you can see on the slide that one person remarked that they weren't getting enough money for working on this boat. The only reason the person stayed, they kept on telling me they would sort the contract for me. I wanted the contract as soon as possible so I could go and see my family. I stayed for months not getting paid. And when asked what would improve their situation, nearly all the workers that we spoke to focused on immigration issues and focused on changes to immigration status as a way to enhance bargaining power within the work relationship and improve working conditions. So, for example, one of the workers remarked that workers should be free, not controlled by the working permit and stamp 1, because this permit controls them. It also should be noted, and this is detailed in the report, that undocumented workers did appear to have particular problems around very poor working conditions, including a complete lack of certainty about how many hours were to be worked, what pay was to be received, when that pay would be received, and so on. And these workers were very strongly voiced the need to regularise their situation in order to gain more power in that working relationship. So moving on then very quickly to inspections and complaints. Again, this is a section of the report that you can read in detail, but kind of one of the key findings here was that less than half of the interviewees that we spoke to recalled their boats being inspected by the Workplace Relations Commission or anyone else asking about work-related issues. In addition to that, then, we also found that where inspections do happen, there are significant barriers to fishers engaging in a meaningful way with workplace inspectors or pursuing legal complaints. I'm fighting with the drill outside there, sorry. And these included language barriers and the fear of losing one's job or work permit. And I think this is very clearly illustrated by the text on the slide. So in the first quote, you can see the general idea, which is that, you know, if somebody comes to ask about your conditions, you just sign what you need to sign because you're worried about losing your job. And that came through time and again in the interviews. Many workers had a clear sense that rights were being violated, but felt that they couldn't do anything about that because they were scared of losing their contract. So I think this very much ties in with some of David's points about the level of control and coercion that can exist in these work relationships. So finally then, we won't take up too much more of your time in this section, but to move to the recommendations, and these are set out in detail at page 18 of the report, so please do have a look. We've put immigration-related recommendations first because this is what came through most strongly from the words of the participants themselves. So firstly, we suggest that undocumented migrant fishers should be facilitated to access the Department of Justice's planned regularisation scheme, which we understand is due to open at the end of the year. And we follow the Migrant Rights Centre of Ireland and other organisations in calling for that scheme to be as broad and inclusive as possible. Secondly, we suggest that those on short-term atypical working scheme permissions should be facilitated to transition to more flexible, longer-term immigration statuses. And this would effectively enable the exercise of bargaining power in the work relationship and also allow people to change employer more easily if a problem arises. So outside of that then, there are some other recommendations in the report. So we suggest that if the atypical working scheme is to be retained, that it really needs to be completely reviewed and overhauled. And I think that I've read in recent days that some of the fish producer organisations are of the similar view that that needs to happen. We suggest that permits should be granted for the sector rather than tied to an individual employer, even though at the moment it's permissible to change employer under the scheme for various reasons. That's extremely difficult in practice. We also suggest that the model contract which is used in the atypical working scheme is completely at odds with practices in the industry. So it essentially provides for a 40-hour week, whereas that is at odds with what actually happens in the industry. We also suggest that in terms of inspections and compliance, that the relevant workplace inspection bodies, so this is the WRC and the Marine Survey Office in this case, that they really, on the basis of what we heard from participants, it would be ideal if they could perform more direct outreach work, speak directly to fishers in private, away from the employer, as a matter of course when they're doing inspections, and of course to use trained interpreters. So a couple of final things, and again this is all contained in the report, but Ethel spoke about the legal barriers that are there to claiming employment rights for undocumented workers. We suggest that this needs to be reconsidered. One important recommendation that I'd just like to highlight now is that from speaking to the interviewees in our study, non-governmental organisations play a really important role in this sector in terms of supporting migrant workers to realise their realise their employment rights in practice, to pursue complaints, to report violations. So, for example, the ITF, the Migrant Rights Centre Ireland, and other organisations do play an important role, and we think that this could be better recognised by the state. So, for example, if somebody is receiving or renewing a work permit, why couldn't they be given information and contact details about supportive organisations? And then finally, and this is perhaps an issue for another day, but a number of workers did mention the fact that some fishing vessels may be undercrewed. And obviously, when you think about this, this means that there's more work involved for everybody on board and much longer hours involved if there's not enough people working on the vessels. So we suggest that this could be an area of investigation for the state as well. So I think we've taken enough of your time now. So I'd just like to hand over to Micahel O'Brien of the ITF to respond to the report.
Well, thanks very much, Clíodhna. Before I get into it, I want to say hello to Joshua from Ghana, who made along. Joshua was a former fisher who was accepted into the National Referral Mechanism for Human Trafficking. You're very welcome, Joshua, and Joshua is available to chat afterwards to public representatives in the media. And there's a group of Egyptian fishers who are active fishers at the moment, and Mohammed at the back, who's not a fisher but who speaks decent English, is available to interpret if anybody wants to speak to our Egyptian fishers on an anonymised basis. So you're all very welcome. I want to thank Ethel Buckley for launching the report and for SIPTU's endorsement of the findings and the commitment to cooperate with the ITF in our campaign in fisheries, and obviously commend the work of Maynooth University. It was quite an intensive few months, punctuated by the holidays, in which I had to hare around the place and try and convince both documented and undocumented fishers from Egypt, from Ghana and from the Philippines to participate. Obviously, there's issues of trust and security and so on, but the guys were all very reassured by the approach taken by Maynooth. So look at the picture that's been painted is very clear. The atypical scheme has been in existence for 5.5 years. There was High Court proceedings in the middle of those 5 years taken by the ITF by my predecessor, Ken Fleming, when it became apparent to us at that point that the atypical scheme itself was a tool for human trafficking. That resulted in a mediation process between the ITF and the state that concluded in April 2019. There was a 20-point agreement that on paper ought to have improved the situation, tipped the balance of power somewhat in favour of the fisher and away from the vessel owner to whom the fisher is tied in the atypical scheme. But we're 2.5 years on from that again, and obviously COVID intervened. But the picture that we have now is an up-to-date picture of continuing overwork, consequential underpayment that arises from the overwork, attendant abuses including racist and Islamophobic abuse. And by the way, we had to wait until Ramadan was over before we could embark upon the whole project, because it's such a it's bad enough to work a 20-hour day, but to work a 20-hour day when you're fasting from dawn to dusk is quite a challenge. And then to get Islamophobic abuse from your skipper is worse again. And then, of course, there's the precarious migration status. And that goes for both the documented and the undocumented fishers. The documented fishers in the atypical scheme, as has been said ad nauseum, are tied to the individual boat owner. And there's practical consequences about that I'll go into in a moment. And then obviously the undocumented, of whom there are hundreds, I have no doubt. And most of those hundreds actually entered Ireland in the first instance with the atypical scheme. And then what happens is that because of the overwork, many of them get injured, back injuries, loss of digits. They have to recuperate. The Egyptian guys tend to go home to Egypt to recuperate, and then they come back to Ireland again. But one way or another, they fall out of the scheme and are left having to odd job on a boat here and a boat there, and live in that twilight zone, and desperate to kind of get back into a documented arrangement. But that's the way it is. If I could digress slightly, it came to my attention a few weeks ago that Bord East Warra are doing a labour force survey of the fishing industry, and that intrigued me. I seen it on one of the Twitter pages of one of the industry publications. So I got in contact with them and asked them, how are you doing this survey to find out how the fleets are staffed, crewed? And I was informed that it was done on the basis of an English language survey that was predominantly going to be completed by the vessel owners. And I just said, well, guys, the vessel owners are not going to disclose their undocumented crews. So if they do the exercise again, I'm hoping that they'll work with the ITF and we can get the surveys out in the language, preferred language of the migrants, and actually to get a truer picture of actually how the 180 or so vessels that are eligible for the atypical scheme are actually being crewed, because currently it's 230 spread across 180 large vessels. They are undercrewed, it's true, but still it doesn't add up, and the missing part of the equation is the undocumented crew that's out there. The WRC, when PQs are posed by the likes of Deputy Mick Barry there, my former employer, they will tell us truthfully that there have been hundreds of detections made by the WRC and the MSO in their inspections over the years. That is absolutely true. But the downside of that is that there hasn't been an improvement in the situation. And the reason for that is that the fines that result when you do get some prosecutions down the line, and most of the time it ends in voluntary compliance measures and it never ends up in the courts. But when it does, you're talking of not dissuasive fines at all. And therefore a culture of impunity and repeat offending amongst many of the vessel owners that we're made aware of. So we endorse the recommendations, and I think flowing from that, I mean, there are actions and initiatives and events that the ITF will be involved in that we hope will move the situation on and improve the situation. So I'm just going to briefly go through some of those. So tomorrow I'm addressing the Oireachtas Committee for Enterprise, Trade and Employment about how the WRC operates and how we cannot get true justice at the WRC for both documented and undocumented fishers. In the case of undocumented, you cannot get an enforceable ruling from the WRC because they take the position that an undocumented worker's relationship with their employer was not a legal contract to begin with, and therefore they just can't enforce anything. There is an obscure provision in legislation that allows the minister to take the initiative to ostensibly vindicate the rights of the undocumented worker, but we've established, again through a PQ, that it's never been used to any great effect after 7 years on the statute books. We need the likes of the ITF and other affiliated unions, and it's not just fishers, by the way, other undocumented workers, to be able to go to the WRC and get enforceable rulings. There's an issue, and it's covered in today's Irish Independent, the so-called cognizable period, which is a bit of a jargon, but basically any worker, whether you're documented, Irish, undocumented, that if you bring a case to the WRC, you can only reclaim whatever wrong has been done to you over the prior 6 months, which is typically sufficient for most of us. If any of us have a difficulty with our employer, if our employer is not paying us right, most of us won't hang about for 6 months before we try and get redress. But the reality is that there's documented fishers in the atypical scheme who endure recurring daily abuses and underpayments, spanning years in some cases, because of the nature of their relationship with their employer, and they operate on the basis that there will be a day of reckoning, whether it's when they're injured or whenever they fall out with the employer cuts them loose, and then they will come to us in the ITF or SIPTU are taking some of the pending WRC cases and try and recover whatever they can, but it's from a very limited time frame. So these are the issues I'll be bringing to the Oireachtas Committee tomorrow, and there's concrete reforms to various employment acts that could be done to try and improve the situation, and that would improve the situation not just for fishers, but I think for other undocumented and migrant workers likewise. On the issue of working time at sea, there's a working time at sea directive that was wrongly transposed by the Irish Government, by the Department of Transport. They made a mess of it, and consequently, and the Labour Court ruled on this 2 weeks ago, that there's no remedy available. The Labour Court says we don't have jurisdiction to rule on the 20-hour days and the lack of rest periods and so on, and we've nowhere to go. And we've been saying this to the senior civil servants in the relevant departments, that the government wrongly transposed that directive, that there wasn't a clear remedy available. And now we have it in black and white. So we're backing in pending judicial review proceedings. We have a subject who's an Egyptian fisher, ex-fisher I should say, who's going to front the judicial review. But we hope actually that it won't come to pass, and that the pressure we think the government may be coming under from the EU Commission may force them to actually voluntarily retranspose that directive correctly, and we won't have to go down that road. But if they do that, it means that it will have positive knock-on effects for actually quite a few current and impending WRC and Labour Court cases that the ITF are taking, and some that SIPTU are taking for migrant fishers in the coming weeks and months, in fact. Right, so the next issue is around the migration status. The guys are at the edge of their seats in the course issue. Once they became aware that the Department of Justice was going to do a documentation scheme, they're hanging their hopes that this will improve their situation. And it's not certain that it will. All we know is that the Department of Justice said that it's if you're 4 years undocumented, or 3 years in the case of having a child, then you may have a clear path to obtaining a stamp for what would be seen as a very advantageous stamp that doesn't tie you to any employer. It doesn't even tie you to fishing if you want to move on to fishing. The unfortunate thing is that many of our guys don't really fit that bill, that they've been half documented or they were documented up to 2, 3 or 4 years ago. And it's just uncertain about whether they'll be included. Now, the Minister yesterday, Minister Brown, said that in response to this report, that the documentation scheme will be of advantage. You basically hinted at. So we'll see when we see the details that it truly is the case. But meantime, there is another pending judicial review. There's 2 Egyptians, one of whom has been continuously in the atypical scheme from its inception, who applied for a change of status stamp forward, and a big no from the Department of Justice. Now, this guy says to me, Michael, how is it? I've been in the atypical scheme from its very inception, tied to this employer who's not very nice to me, to say the least. That's not the language he uses. And the Department of Justice saying, no, I can't get a stamp for. Whereas my crewmate, who's been undocumented for the last 4 years, this scheme will give him a stamp for. How is that fair? Is it fair? It's not fair. It's very divisive, in fact. And I think I'll put it this way, that this will be the mainstay of our campaign for the next couple of months if the Department of Justice don't get this right and don't make this scheme as inclusive as possible. Just the very last point I want to address is that around the issue of human trafficking. The United States State Department annual TIP report, Trafficking in Persons report, again had Ireland graded at Tier 2 watch list, bottom of the league with Romania, Belarus and Azerbaijan. And the Department of Justice's response was to uniquely contest that fishing is a site of human trafficking, notwithstanding the fact that we've had 35 fishers, including 3 this year, admitted into the National Referral Mechanism for Human Trafficking. So this is going on. There's going to be a reform to the National Referral Mechanism. There's a meeting tomorrow we'll be participating in with some other NGO organisations and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Authority. The problem is ongoing. There's 4 Ghanaians in Balseskin at the moment. Now, they were trafficked into Northern Ireland and then they've come down here. And the problem hasn't gone away. I'm going to Senegal this Sunday for a week-long conference of the International Transport Federation, their West Africa project. I'm having face-to-face discussions with our brothers in the Ghanaian seafarers unions. I'm going to bring to them a dossier of the bogus agents in Ghana that are working with the Irish vessel owners north and south to bring them into this country and put them out living on the boats and not paying them properly. To see can these guys be taken out, but also to run a bit of an information campaign in the Ghanaian fishing communities to make sure people know the pitfalls of coming to Ireland to work on a fishing vessel, to get in touch with ourselves in the ITF first, and we can tell you what class of boat owner you're potentially working for. So there's a lot of things are going to flow from this report. I'm very thankful to Maynooth and SIPTU as well for kind of raising the profile of what we're doing. I think that there's been hopefully a shift in awareness because of the volume of mainstream media articles in the last few days and what will be happening in today's press and media as well, but also the Oireachtas Committee appearance tomorrow, and that if there's widespread public awareness and fundamental acceptance that there's something rotten ongoing in the Irish fishing industry, well, hopefully we can shift the legal and political terrain on this in the coming weeks and months. And I do hope, to me, this is all about actually liberating the fishers themselves, getting them their stamp forward so actually they have more agency, and it won't be us up here, but actually we'll have some events and so on where actually the migrant fishers themselves will be fronting this, and actually you'll hear their voices more directly. So thanks very much, Clíodhna and David, for your work.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Michael. Yes, and ideally we wouldn't be the ones up here at the table, but it's for the fishers that we interviewed, people are in a very precarious position, so we're glad to at least be able to report the perspectives. So if anybody has any questions, I'm not sure if there is questions through the live stream or if you can see that. But anyway, if anybody in the room has any questions, please feel free to go ahead. Yeah, so there's 2. I'll work forward. So Rona, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a million. Thanks for the invite from Michael for today, and well done to everybody on the work. It's absolutely fantastic. My name is Rona. I'm from Unite Trade Union. And Ethel mentioned about the workers' experience itself being part of this research and how important that was. And that's obviously, I completely agree 100% with that. We recently in Unite did a research document into the hospitality in the sector in Ireland. And there's an awful lot of similarities in your findings and our findings. What the workers' voice itself actually reveals is something that you don't find anywhere else, and that is the extent and the dynamics in workplaces, the extent of the intimidation and the fear that workers have over a prize and of losing their job and so on. And I think that it is really, really necessary that we hear those voices more and more and more. I think just looking at the recommendations, and this is a bit of a question. the recommendations around the WRC, it's clear from our work and from a lot of the people that we spoke to that it's not really adequate for a lot of workers to go to the WRC, and the WRC is also not resourced currently enough to carry out the necessary inspections across a number of sectors where exploitation is rife, and that includes fisheries, agri-food business and the hospitality sector and many, many more. And I think what's missing for me a little bit in the recommendations, maybe I haven't read it properly yet, but is the need to overhaul our trade union legislation in this country, because at the moment it is not friendly towards trade unions, and therefore not friendly towards workers. Apart from the right to collective bargaining, which I think is crucial, there's no trade union access to workplaces, which leaves these sectors and these industries and these bad employers free to continue to exploit in an isolated and hidden way, because we have no access. We don't even have the right to a notice board in most workplaces. And I think that, you know, I'd just like to maybe address why that itself around trade union rights and legislation isn't in your recommendations. Maybe it is, but just at a glance I don't see anything specific there about it.
Yeah, thanks very much. I might just repeat the question just for the live stream purposes, just for the microphone. So that's Rona McCord from Unite Trade Union, pointing out that Unite has also conducted research in this area with migrant workers in the hospitality industry and reflecting similar experiences, and also the importance, you're emphasising the importance of the voice of the workers. Rona was asking why there wasn't more of an emphasis in here on, I guess, the trade union angle, and I suppose pointing out some of the gaps there that exist in trying to take cases to the WRC. Ethel may speak to that more than I would, but just from the perspective of this report, I suppose the focus really of what we were doing was speaking to the participants themselves. So I think the fact that the participants themselves weren't really speaking in those terms about collective bargaining and so on is probably answers your question in some ways. It wasn't something that came up to us from the interview process as something that is really on the radar of these particular workers, despite the fact that they link in regularly with the ITF and other supportive organisations. So perhaps Ethel or Michael might like to speak to that question a little bit more.
Yeah, I think I would agree with a lot of what Rona has said, except that in the case of fishing, the access issue is completely different to workplaces such as hotels or restaurants or pubs or shops, and that's the point that I was making, that it's a unique access issue. It's at sea. It's moving, you know, so which makes it very, very different, obviously. And also the point that I was making, and I think that, you know, the affiliates of the ITF in Ireland need to support the ITF in its work, because the work is so unique that the ITF does. It's not comparable really to shore-based organising and representative work, and that's why I think the ITF does it, and it's a globalised industry. I can't really speak to the recommendations in the report, that's for the researchers to do, but I will say this about the WRC. The WRC the Workplace Relations Commission for people watching abroad, which is the third-party institutions in Ireland, it can only operate within the current legislative framework that's there, okay? And it is incumbent on, that's what I said at the end of my piece. This should be a call to arms to trade unionists, to politicians watching, to policymakers, to journalists, to the law academics, who are the people who can identify the lacunas in the legislation, ultimately. They are the people who can say, if this section of this legislation were to change in this way, the situation would be improved. And that is why I think working with law academics is so important for trade unions. And indeed, you'd have to call out Maynooth Law Department in particular, I would say, for the work that it contributes to employment legislation, reform of employment legislation in Ireland. I think that would be the best way to put it. So that's why I would commend the ITF for engaging with Maynooth. But what we need to do, Rona, all of us, is we need to change the legislation within which the WRC operates. Because we all know that the WRC has a statutory obligation and commitment to deal with worker exploitation. And I have no doubt that the WRC will do it, but it can only do it within the framework it has. So we need to change that framework so that it works better for all undocumented people. And then in the inspection regime for fishers, which is so unique, that is changed to reflect the fishing industry, which is quite different to the shore-based industries that we'd be more used to, I would say.
I mean, the only point I would add, just to give a particular anonymised case study of a recent WRC case, which is adjourned and is ongoing, that the other side, the vessel owner side, cited the fact that there was a WRC inspection 6 weeks after the two Filipino fishers commenced work for this particular vessel owner, and that they didn't disclose anything to the WRC inspector at that time. I mean, come on. I mean, these are guys that arrived just from the Philippines, and 6 weeks on the boat. They meet this guy from the state, and they within the vicinity of the vessel owner, they don't disclose the problems they were already encountering, and this is used as a line of defence. And the claim by the WRC, this is the operational issues as opposed to the legislative constraints they work in, that the lack of interpretation is not a great impediment to what they do. I find that incomprehensible, because I need to arrange interpretation for the vast bulk of the work I do and the interactions I have with the guys. Obviously, the guys from Ghana, many of them do speak English, but not all of them do. Very few of the Egyptians and very few of the Filipinos do, even after years. And particularly, I'd say with the Filipinos, you have this churn going on in the industry where the vessel owners have moved on from employing Egyptians more so for Filipinos who tend to live on the vessels. The Ghanaians tend to live on the vessels as well. Makes them very, very hard to reach. And just to echo the point that was made by Ethel, and there's some very unique features in terms of even the WRC cases that we take. I have to get data off the Navy about vessel movements and try and construct a case that satisfies a WRC adjudicator that a crew of 4, 2 weeks out at sea, showing them the movements from the Navy, cannot have caught 5 ton of prawns, without having worked a 20-hour day. It's like a very complicated algebra problem from your leaving cert. But you have to do, and they judge it on the balance of probabilities. And my predecessors have successfully done so. I have my first cases impending, so I hope to emulate them. So balance of probabilities. The only issue I'd say is that for undocumented workers, and the one case study that kind of has gotten me this gig tomorrow at the Enterprise Trade and Employment Committee, because they were undocumented workers, it was up to the WRC officials to try and construct that case, and they had the evidence to do it, in my opinion, but they didn't run with it because they set themselves a very high bar, a very high threshold for proof. Whereas we go with what we get, the testimony and the evidence, and we know it's balance of probabilities, and therefore we can sometimes get results. But the 7 years the WRC have had to kind of take cases for undocumented workers, they haven't done so successfully. So there's an issue there. That's an operational issue, I would say. But there are, as Ethel says, there's legislative issues, and I'll be cataloguing them all tomorrow, like in the 8 minutes I have to address the committee. Although I do hope the friendly TDs will ask me some very helpful and leading questions that'll give me some more time.
Just one final point, perhaps, on that is that I think actually the point which Ethel makes is really important, which is that despite all the problems that we have seen, there has been a real attempt by many state bodies to engage with this issue of problems within the fishing industry. So we had open engagement with the Workplace Relations Commission, the Marine Survey Office, in terms of responding to our questions that we had. And I think where we would see it as there are systemic issues there around how the framework operates and its flexibility or inflexibility in adapting to particular work settings, which I think is really important to note as well. So, I mean, it's like it is a systemic issue as well at the end of the day. Okay, any more questions? Or I'm not sure if we can see questions on the live feed or if there's anything coming up there. I don't want to leave out. Oh, sorry, of course, yeah.
So, I just wanted to ask, because you kept talking about the stamp one issue and being tailored to your employer. So this is kind of a wider issue that every worker on general employment permit experiences. Why do you think it's urgent for people who work at fisheries to kind of have the freedom to change employers in particular.
Do you want to?
I suppose all the discussion tends to, when there's a legal framework, kind of look at employment law remedies and public law remedies and legislative change. But you know, when we're our studies, really what we wanted to do here was to give voice to the workers, and you know, I think the human dimension cannot be forgotten. All these individuals want to do is actually work and enjoy normal employment rights. Nothing extraordinary, just what we all enjoy. And I think many of these workers will continue, if they had those rights, would continue to work. For instance, if you proper payment, proper conditions, all the things that we enjoy as a matter of course. I think if they if they got the opportunity to receive them, many would also continue to work in the fishing industry because they have immense skill in this particular field. So I think that's really the reason why we emphasise that, is because there was just a sheer human frustration at the inability to be able to move employer if they wish to, and that trapped of not being able to go visit relatives and not, you know, having to endure horrific conditions in order just to survive without limited choice.
Yes, so just again to echo what David said, I mean, it just came very strongly through the interviews that obviously the fishing industry, as many of the participants noted, is a tough industry because it's very hard work. And where you've got on top of that, I guess people need the flexibility to change employer if a problem does arise, without feeling that will affect their immigration status and potentially end up resulting in their removal from Ireland. So I think that was one of the biggest barriers that we saw to actually engaging with inspection regimes and pursuing complaints was around this question of losing the work permit and losing your contract. So I think a freedom to change employer being built into the system would really help that. Okay, any more questions? Are we all?
Shamim, if you want to talk, the Egyptian guys are still outside.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I think we can close off the session then. So thanks very much to everyone, and for all those who are tuning in on the live stream. And as we say, the report is available on the ITF website and the Maynooth University Department of Law website, and we'll be circulating the link afterwards. So thanks very much to everyone.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks for